Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 53. So by calendrical weeks, this is actually the start of year 2 of the Drydock. Well, an awful lot has been said so far, so let's continue on that trend. Some good news, the gigantic superstructure of Doom should be wending its way in artwork form to Spreadshirt at some point in the immediate future, possibly, hopefully by the time you've listened to this. Working on the Jellicoe and the Crushing Hand of God artwork as well, courtesy of my wife, who luckily has the ability to draw. I have the ability to throw paint at things, and that's about it, really. Except for some bizarre reason if you ask me to paint 40k miniatures, but never mind. Outside of that, I can confirm now that there are plans in the works for a tour of American museum ships at some point in the first half of next year. So hopefully that will be fun. If anyone has any top recommendations as to which museum ships to visit, obviously sound off in the comments below. Obviously, I know Texas won't be available at that point, but Olympia definitely is on the list. And I know there's a lot of battleships, so I'd also want to dig up some of these slightly more obscure ones as well. So let's get on with the actual part of the video you're all here for. So this week's selected questions are coming from the USS Johnston and Room 40 videos for the first 20 minutes, and the sources used for those videos are, of course, Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, can't tell a good story of USS Johnston without that particular publication, and some of the background history from Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships, hosted so kindly by Naval History and Heritage Command of the United States Navy. And when it comes to the Room 40 video, of course, there are quite a number, as per all videos, there's quite a lot of different sources used for minor bits and pieces of video, but the primary ones were Castles of Steel by Robert Massey, which mentions a number of their achievements in passing. There's also the more recent The Codebreakers, the secret intelligence unit that changed the course of the First World War. It was a pretty good read. And, of course, the other one which was quite helpful in extensive parts of the reference was Inside Room 40, The Codebreakers of World War One. So, yeah, that's those for those. And let's get on with the question. ST Rub, or Strub, or S-Strub, I don't know, asks, if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, how would the British and US navies change their focus or doctrine for the blockade of Japan? Well, some clues can be derived from looking at what the Royal and US navies were actually doing in the run-up to the Japanese surrender. As you can see here, courtesy of USS Indiana, shore bombardment by battleship was a thing. The Japanese, at this point, basically didn't have much of a navy left to stop them. And if they tried, well, the Essex swarm combined with the Fletcher swarm would quite rapidly see any attempts at sorting put to the bottom in fairly short order. Now, the Japanese did keep back quite a number of kamikaze aircraft for the final defense of the home islands, so there, if you can believe it, would probably have been even more intense kamikaze attacks. But they probably would have been directed more at the landing forces themselves. So I suspect you would see things like the Atlantas, the Didos, the Alaskas, maybe, although the Alaskas, to be fair, probably with the carriers, probably fighter-dedicated escort carriers, etc., all clustering very close into the landing zones in order to provide air cover and mass anti-aircraft barrage firepower to take out incoming Japanese kamikaze strikes. Meanwhile, the rest of the fleet, you probably would have just had roving packs of Essexes and the occasional British armoured carrier rolling up and down the Japanese coast, launching air attacks at targets of opportunity, and bombardment groups of older battleships and some of the newer ones as well, again just shooting up whatever was in the way. I suspect some of the largest and most capable bombardment units, so perhaps things like the South Dakotas, would probably have been delegated to support the landings, because there's just not that much in the way that the Japanese can do anything to them except for via the realm of kamikaze attacks, and at this point there's more than enough anti-aircraft guns on the various battleships and cruisers and destroyers to protect them as long as they stick together. So yeah, basically roving death squads of British and American ships looking for things that haven't yet been exploded. REX1 asks, the practicality of the US turning the French liner Normandie into the world's largest aircraft carrier at 80,000 tons before she caught fire. Well, I suppose that is a rather important qualifier. Well, I mean, there's nothing that says that it can't be done. I mean, the Normandy is a very large. One of the main problems is actually too large. You're not going to get it through the Panama Canal, which is going to add a significant amount of time to getting it over to the Pacific, which, let's face it, is probably where the US is going to need it at the time when it's actually completed, if you go down that route. Now, let's be clear, the US did not intend to do this. They, in fact, wanted to turn it into a troop carrier, which is what it was in the process of being converted into when it caught fire. And realistically speaking, it would have been a lot more practical in that perspective. You had ships like the Queen Mary, which was obviously in peacetime the Normandie's rival, which served greatly in World War II by transporting effectively entire divisions of men in a single go and moving at such a speed that U-boats were just like, I hear a ship coming. Pops out periscope. Huh. Oh well. Back to looking for merchantmen. Never mind. Yes, so anyway, slight diversion aside. Yeah, Normandy would have been much better off as a troop carrier. I mean, you can see from the size of those funnels. Breaking this thing down to turn it into a carrier would have been an absolute pig. You've got to strip off all the funnels, you've got to take out all the trunking to the massive engines, and you can see from the space of the funnels just how big the power plant is there. You're probably going to have to shave off the entire superstructure down to maybe 2 decks above the sort of the black painted hull lines. And then you're going to have to build an entire carrier deck on top of that, and then you're going to have to hollow out the interior for your hangar decks, etc., etc. And the simple fact is, it's an ocean liner. It's not designed to anywhere near the same kind of military standards as battleship and battlecruiser conversions. Now, that's not to say that ocean liner conversions to carriers hadn't been done in the past. They had been, the Pretoria Castle and the Argus being 2 very good examples of that. But it's, as I say, it's just not going to be built to the same kind of military standards. So it's either going to be a case of accepting that you have a very large, very obvious target that is significantly less well disposed to being bombed or torpedoed as compared to an actual proper carrier or converted military ship into a carrier. Or you're going to have to spend even more time and resources not only cutting the ship down and hollowing it out, but also adding all sorts of extra bits and pieces to the hull, to the structure, torpedo defences, which surprisingly enough don't rate very highly when it comes to constructing a cruise liner, or an ocean liner, should I say. So yeah, it would have taken a lot of time, and given that when the US got their hands on the Normandie, I mean, you might, if you'd pushed the boat out, might have managed to get it into service a year, maybe a year and a half before the first Essex, and it would have made a rather nice centerpiece, and probably provided some relatively useful service. But as I say, it would have been a case of most likely, let's just hope it doesn't get hit. And once the Essex class come into service, it probably would have then been very quickly relegated either to aircraft ferrying duty in the Atlantic, where it probably, and the Mediterranean, where it probably could have actually done a fairly good job, or maybe back as a large training carrier back at home. I can't see the US putting something this large and this vulnerable out on the front lines in the war against Japan pretty much at all, for unless and until they absolutely have to. So maybe HMS Victorious isn't assigned to the Pacific because they still have this thing, whatever they choose to call it. But I think that's about as far as it'd go. Tamron Star Shadow asks, if a PT boat has torpedo launchers mounted at an angle, how do they make the torpedoes shoot straight instead of a V shape that will never hit anything? The answer to this is basically that by the time of World War II, torpedoes, which had to a certain degree always been semi-self-guiding in as much as they kept themselves in a straight line through the use of gyroscopes, but they had also developed to the point where you could preset the guidance fins on a torpedo to correct its course to a certain degree after launch, and then in theory it would straighten up and head off in the general direction of the target. This is why, for example, in the mid-1930s you had US destroyers with 16 torpedo tubes spread out on either side, with their modus operandi being to charge the enemy and launch all the torpedoes at once. And you think, well, how on earth can they possibly do that? It's the same thing, basically. Launch it out as forward angle as possible, but with a setting on the gyros and the fins to make them turn by a certain percentage of a full circle, then straighten out. This works in theory, and when you are firing a torpedo that only has to turn a small amount, it tended to work in practice as well. When you tried to make a torpedo do a fairly significant turn immediately after launch, it could work, and certain times it really didn't. It seems that the more you ask the torpedo to do its preset turn at a larger angle before it straightens up, the more likely it is for there to be a failure. And quite a number of ships and submarines on both sides during the war did actually end up going down through being hit by their own torpedoes. When they launched them, the torpedoes started turning and never stopped and just came back to its original launching position, which happened to be occupied by the ship that had launched it, and that was a somewhat embarrassing way to go, I guess. Bismarck asks, how comes the Imperial Japanese Navy and Imperial Japanese Army had such a terrible relationship during World War II? Well, all branches of militaries in almost all countries have their own inter-service rivalries, and they can get quite vicious. However, generally, they tend to keep this viciousness to sort of snide remarks and a lot of fighting over budgets and such like. Occasionally, as per the interwar RAF and Fleet Air Arm, one will kind of just appropriate part of another, but it generally goes around without too much bloodshed. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy kind of took that up to 11, in as much as, well, I'd say to a certain degree they probably hated each other more than they hated some of the people they were fighting. They had completely separate developments for practically everything, up to and including, I mean, okay, fair enough. So the Imperial Japanese Navy having its own infantry is not too surprising given the prevalence of Marine Corps. But did you know, for example, that the Imperial Japanese Army had its own aircraft carriers? Yeah, that was a thing, because we can't possibly have the Navy providing us with air support, and similarly with the aircraft as well. They're completely separate lines of development for fighters, bombers, attack craft, etc., which diluted and diverted resources that would have been much better served by having at least some form of semi-unified structure for R&D. The best way I can think of it is, I don't know if any of you will, well, presumably some of you will have watched The Simpsons. If you maybe look up the groundskeeper Willie's little rant about the Scots. Yeah, insert Japanese officers for Scots, and that's pretty much the attitude of the entire Japanese officer corps to a large extent during World War II. It's not just the fact that the Navy and the Army didn't get on by a long shot. As we've said before, there was almost a Klingon level of rivalry between officers within the same naval service or army service. It was a very vicious and cutthroat, quite literally at times, environment to be in. So, quite how this arose, well, I guess that's what happens when you spend several years - decades on nationalism and Bushido codes, taken to the very worst possible extremes. But there you go. Juan Carosio asks, hi, Drac. Could I ask a question about turbines and vibrations? I've heard that all turbine ships, such as the Cunard liners, had lots of problems with vibrations, while the White Star liners had triple expansion and low-pressure turbines. Was this problem, i.e. turbine vibrations, also an issue in warships? It could be. It doesn't What didn't necessarily follow. I mean, the simple fact is that warships are built a lot more solidly than ocean liners, which shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. And therefore, things like the fixtures and fittings that were used to secure turbines to the rest of the ship um, tended to be a lot stronger and tended to have a lot more shock absorption capability in them because, well, ultimately, those things are there not only to preserve the ship from the turbines, but also to preserve the turbines from the rest of the ship in the event of shell impacts and torpedo impacts and other such things that might badly affect the workings of a turbine, assuming it's not a direct hit. So, to a certain degree, some of the vibration problems experienced by early Cunard liners were as a result of basically just going for relatively lightweight fittings because there was very much the need for speed. But at the same time, you've also got to remember that a lot of those early ships that were using turbines were very early adopters beyond even what navies were doing. You've also got to remember that these ships, the cruise liners that is, were packing in massively more powerful turbines than you would have had in period warships of the same era. So if you look at, say, RMS Mauritania, that's constructed in sort of 1904 through to 1906, coming into service in 1907, which is around about the same time as dreadnoughts being built. But Mauritania is running at around about 70,000 shaft horsepower on its steam turbines, whereas Dreadnought's running on 23,000. So, yeah, there's an awful lot more power going into these early cruise ships because, well, they're aiming for much higher speeds. Not that it tends to work out too well, given that Mauritania gets up to around about 24 knots, give or take, depending on its whether you believe trials or design speed or in-service speed. I suppose at the same time it was a much bigger ship. But anyway, yeah, so it's a combination of civilian design standards, the fact that they're adopting turbines very early and they're running them up to massively higher power levels than in almost any capital ship at the time. That basically is the reason why they had a lot of prevalent vibration issues. Outside of that, obviously, you do have issues with some warships just having vibrations either through bad turbines, bad design, or mismatches of design, such as the vibration issues that the North Carolina class battleships would eventually have, albeit that was more down to the propellers than anything else. And also the fact that turbines just run at a lot higher revolutions compared to triple expansion engines, or, as was the case in some of the 1900s era cruise liners, quadruple expansion engines, which most navies took one look at and just went, no, I don't think so. Jeremy Wells asks, why were the huge numbers of pre-dreadnoughts owned by Germany in the UK almost never used in either the Grand Fleet or the High Seas Fleet? I know the Germans brought some to Jutland, but most scholarship indicates this was with extreme reluctance on Scheer's part. Naval historians of the period state they were all obsolete, and the main reason being because they were. Most of the later designs of pre-dreadnoughts had the same guns as early dreadnoughts. Surely they could have contributed something in a fleet engagement, even if it was just catching shells for more important targets. The main reason was that they genuinely were obsolete, and this was for quite a number of reasons when you consider a dreadnought battle line. Yes, a lot of the later classes carried a similar armament, however, guns were advancing quite quickly, so it wasn't just a case of, well, this ship has 12-inch guns or 11-inch guns. The 11-inch gun or 12-inch gun put on a pre-dreadnought built in 1900 would be a very different beast to the 12 or 11-inch gun put on a dreadnought in 1905 or 1906. Obviously, there was a little bit of overlap, such as, say, the guns for HMS Nelson, HMS Lord Nelson, and HMS Agamemnon being identical to the ones that were used in Dreadnought, to the extent that Fisher stole the guns intended for the last Royal Navy pre-Dreadnoughts to facilitate Dreadnought being completed sooner. But that's a very small overlap. There are a number of other issues, however, though one of which is fire control systems, which were rapidly advancing during the 1900s, to the point that a pre-dreadnought built in 1901, 1902 would be hopelessly behind the curve compared to a dreadnought that went into service in 1906 or 1907. and you'd have to go through a lot of expensive refits at a time when this is fairly new technology, and pretty much every modern fire control system that you're building is being desperately slammed into the next dreadnought or battle cruiser that you're building. Then you've got the fact there are only 4 guns, so you're bringing a ship to the table that has significantly less firepower, even if you are going to spend the money updating its fire control systems. They're generally not as well protected, especially once you start getting into the sort of 13.5 and 14 and 15-inch armed ships that were around during World War One. But to be perfectly honest, the single largest consideration is almost certainly going to be speed. And speed is a major issue because the average battle line speed when they're going all out for a dreadnought fleet, say the high seas fleet or the ground fleet, is around 21 knots, give or take. Some ships, some units, like some of the British ships, can move a bit faster. Some ships, such as say the US battle line in the World War One period, probably is a little bit slower because a number of those ships are still using vertical triple expansions, which don't tend to do well for prolonged periods at high speed. But generally, 21 knots, give or take, is roughly what you're looking at. Most pre-dreadnoughts, with the exception of the odd Italian ship, are never going to make that speed. They're designed for sort of 17, 18 knots, give or take a bit, and all of them are running on vertical triple expansions, which means that's an ambition. They're probably more capable of maybe 16 knots sustained. And on top of that, you've got the fact that because they're older, a lot of them, even ones that were built in sort of 1900, 1901, are a little bit neglected. So whether or not they can even make that speed is questionable. And bringing them in along with the dreadnoughts is going to tie your fleet down significantly. This is why the Germans really didn't want to bring the pre-dreadnoughts, and were pretty much forced to due to lack of ships and the fact that poor old Admiral Mauve was desperate to get into the action. You can kind of see what happens when you bring a pre-dreadnought to a dreadnought fight, apart from the fact to say that being slower, they're going to tie the fleet down, which means the enemy fleet can outmaneuver you and chase you down. But you've got things like Pommern, single torpedo, kaboom, end of ship. A single torpedo into a pre-dreadnought or a battle cruiser is not going to have that effect. A number of dreadnoughts and battle cruisers were torpedoed in the First World War, but there was never a case of a single torpedo being responsible for such a ship's sinking. And as performance-wise, if they come up against an enemy dreadnought or battlecruiser, they're going to lose. You look at what the German pre-dreadnoughts in the high seas fleet actually accomplished when they ran into the British battlecruisers in a night action. They were forced to withdraw with significant damage. Now, for all the memes you might put up around British battlecruisers and the fact they explode, well, they're usually a little bit overdone, but the simple fact is that regardless of how much of the memery you believe relative to their actual combat capacity, the simple fact of the matter is that the battle cruisers forced these ships to drop back at penalty of their destruction, and these are ostensibly your battle line units. When your battle line units are losing to jumped up armored cruisers, this is not a good place to be in. So yeah, there's a whole plethora of reasons, but effectively it comes down to the fact that an individual pre-dreadnought cannot outfight anything in terms of capital unit that it's likely to come across, so you can need them in vast numbers. If they make up the majority of your fleet, you're then limiting your fleet speed to a point that you can be outmaneuvered and the enemy can choose the time and place of engagement. And on top of that, is the simple fact that they just aren't able to take the kind of damage that dreadnoughts especially were capable of taking. If it had come down to, say, the hypothetical where Admiral Jellicoe realises for whatever reason that the Germans are heading for Horns Reef and ends up there on the morning of the day after the original Battle of Jutland, regardless of what else happens, those pre-dreadnoughts are not making it home, and they're not going to contribute all that much. They're going to get blown out of the water by pretty much anything that they come across. So yeah, that is unfortunately the case of the pre-dreadnought when it comes to fighting in the battle lines of the First World War. Chris 2004 asks, assuming the N3 class was built, how would it stand up in a fight against the Yamato? Well, this is one of the perennial questions I see in a number of posts, so yes, I'll address it. The N3 class are a surprisingly close match for fighting the Yamato, but there are some differences and advantages and disadvantages on either side. So if we're assuming that the N3 was built and it's fighting Yamato, so we're talking about mid to late World War II, I'm going to assume that the N3 has been through some kind of refit. Maybe not quite to the same extent that Queen Elizabeth or Valiant got, but maybe something like a Warspite style modernization, or at the very least a Royal Oak style update. So, and bear in mind this is the mid-war, so it's probably going to have Type 274 radar, etc. So let's go through. Let's go the basic triangle: speed, firepower, protection. So protection-wise, they're very comparable. They've both got sort of 8 to 9 inches maximum thickness deck. The belt armor on the N3 is an inch narrower at 15 inches, but it's inclined more heavily. So equivalent protection is going to vary depending on range and drop of shell, obviously, but it's probably going to be near as much as makes no difference. Similar. Torpedo protection, well, N3 has torpedo protection in theory against a 750-pound warhead, so but it's not really going to matter in a one-on-one duel with Yamato because Yamato has no torpedoes. Yamato does have a torpedo protection system that's designed for a slightly more powerful torpedo. However, it does have a rather critical weakness in as much as the torpedo protection system actually focuses the force of the blast and forces armor into its own upper magazines, which is not the best design feature, to be perfectly honest. And N3 does have torpedoes because it's one of the predecessors to Nelson's. Of course it has torpedoes, which would be quite amusing if it all came down to which battleship can torpedo the other, and N3's like, well, I have torpedoes and you do not, so I win. No, that would be it's possible, but it would require a rather serious level of mess up on somebody's part. So yeah, protection, you can pretty much call it a wash in terms of belt and deck armor, with if it comes down to torpedoes, the Yamato has a disadvantage there, obviously. Speed, Yamato definitely has the advantage here. The N3s were designed for 23 knots, and even if they do a one-for-one replacement with modern machinery in the mid-30s, that's still probably only going to give it a knot or two more. They are battleships. They're designed as battleships. They're not got the sleek lines of a battle cruiser. You're not going to get a Congo-style jump in speed, especially considering that any refit is going to add other weight. So the overall increase in power is not going to give them the theoretical maximum increase in speed. But even if it's capable of 24, 25 knots, Yamato is quite happy at 27, so it has a tactical advantage in speed, definitely. So Yamato can dictate the engagement to a certain degree, assuming that they just don't go broadside on and decide that it's the most honourable thing to just blast away at the enemy ship until they realise it's gotten disturbingly close, which is entirely possible. Firepower, so they're both armed with 3 triple turrets carrying 18, or in the case of Yamato, technically 18.1-inch guns. It's a bit of a toss-up here because the on-paper stats of the 18.1-inch gun are theoretically superior to the what can be discerned of the designs for the 18-inch 45 caliber gun that the N3s were supposed to carry. The flip side is that with the diving shells, the Yamato does sacrifice a certain degree of its theoretical maximum penetration to get that diving shell capability. And although the N3s aren't fully armoured against diving shells were considered in its design, so there is a certain degree of underwater protection to mitigate against those kind of things. So ultimately, to be honest, it's an 18-inch shell. It's incredibly powerful at the kind of ranges that either side is actually going to be hitting the other at. The chances are that it's pretty much a wash, I would say. I'd give the edge to the Yamato in theory, but giving the edge to the Yamato in the realms of 18-inch guns firing at each other at relatively short distances, in naval terms, is like saying, well, yes, this person has the advantage in killing you if he runs you down with a 32-ton HGV, as compared to this person who is only hitting you with a 7.5-ton moving van. I doubt you're really going to appreciate the difference that much. Now, in terms of accuracy, that's your firepower, protection, and speed dealt with. There are other issues. I mean, the N3 is going to have a definite advantage. It's almost certainly going to be carrying a Type 274 radar and possibly other radars. Yamato has a very basic radar later on in its life, so sensors, definitely that's going to be the N3's advantage. So kind of like when we matched up Iowa and Yamato, in rough weather, advantage N3 because it can actually see what the heck is going on. You have, in theory, a very long-range near-miss by Yamato against USS White Plains at Samar, but that's still under dispute as to exactly who scored that hit. There's some legitimate argument to be made to say it could have been Yamato, but there's also plenty of other argument to be made by other historians that it wasn't, and it was another ship that was closer in, probably one of the heavy cruisers. Be that as it may, the Yamato did not score any further hits at anything like that range, so yes, the range that either side could open fire at would be considerable. The range at which they're actually going to start hitting again is probably not going to be much more than the typical World War II serious engagement range of about 20 to 22,000 yards. N3 probably has a theoretical firepower advantage in the closing because with its turret layout and the sweep of the superstructure, it can bring more guns to bear at closer angles. But then again, I don't think either side's going to be aiming for that. If they are closing on each other, they'll probably be satisfied with blazing away with the forward turrets only. So yeah, it's as to who would win, it's a bit difficult to call, to be perfectly honest. The N3 has a definite disadvantage with its lack of speed, but as I said, firepower protection wise, it's close enough as it's not really any one side going to have an advantage over the other. The main thing is going to be, I'd say, in a clear day engagement, like lovely calm Pacific Ocean seas, Yamato has the advantage of being able to set the terms of the engagement, and it has fairly accurate guns. So by being able to dictate when and where the engagement takes place, Yamato should have the advantage then. But the minute the visibility drops, whether it be a night action, squalls, rough weather, whatever you want to call it, smoke, then the advantage will probably flip over to the N3. Well, Yamato's not going to necessarily see it, so it's not going to know to use its superior speed to run away or open the engagement range. Whereas N3, refitted to some degree with radar, would be able to see and therefore dictate the engagement and possibly pull off some kind of relatively close range ambush. I mean, we can see what happens in bad weather and visibility when we look at something like Scharnhorst versus Duke of York at the Battle of the North Cape, and if they somehow manage to pull that off and N3 lets rip 12,000 yards, that's going to be one hell of a mess, to say nothing else. And of course, there is always the outside amusing possibility of both sides battering away at each other, not being able to particularly put each other down until it closes to point blank range, and then N3 unleashes the torpedo salvo of complete unexpectedness, which would probably do something, I guess. I mean, it's quite heavyweight torpedoes, but there you go. So yes, a refitted N3 versus Yamato, a very long, I guess, way of saying it would be very close, and I probably put it down to what circumstances they're fighting in. The clearer the weather, the more the advantage to the Yamato. The rougher and worse the weather, the more advantage to the N3. With a big caveat, obviously, about the speed and the fact Yamato can dictate engagement range. So there you go. Spitfire 24 asks, what is the 2019 version of the flagship? In World War II, it was usually battleships, but is it now aircraft carriers, heavy cruisers, submarines, etc., etc.? Basically these days it's usually whatever's the biggest and best equipped ship in the formation that's in question. So, Usually for the big navies, that'll be the aircraft carrier, because, well, it's the biggest ship, it's got the most facilities, and it's the most powerful, which is generally how you designate the flagships. There is, as per the picture here, some dedicated command ships which are designed purely for command and control. The US has two of them at the moment. One of them, as I pictured above there. So that would be the flagship in a formation that involved this particular ship. But that's a relatively uncommon thing. And your broader question, where you're asking kind of what is the modern day battleship or capital ship? Well, in terms of where a battleship sat in terms of prestige and value to a navy, the modern day battleship is probably the aircraft carrier. It occupies that same niche of sort of pinnacle of the fleet, center of the formation, primary striking power of the navy in question. In terms of capital ships, it's a bit of a divided one, because a battleship is very much, or battleship is capital ship is a very much an offensive unit that can go in and attack things and withstand incoming attacks itself. Kind of almost, it should be as lethal on its own as it is with a formation. Aircraft carriers, kind of edging it to say that they are the modern capital ship. If you want, I mean, aircraft carriers, to be honest, yes, they can and will attack and kill enemy ships with their aircraft, but to be perfectly honest, they're mostly power projection tools for beating up enemy countries and land-based air forces, certainly if you're the US Navy. So, capital ship, you could say it's a carrier. You could also make a good argument that it's a submarine, particularly nuclear attack submarine. They are pretty much the ship killers par excellence, and they don't need escorts to go around and do their missions, mainly through the fact they're very stealthy, but also because, well, you don't want a spearfish or an adcap coming towards you, much less six. Or worse, if you have the misfortune to meet up an angry sea wolf class, but never mind. And in terms of the absolute most brutal firepower that you could possibly unleash from a seaborne platform, which I suppose is one way of looking at capital ships, then you'd have to go with, well, it's the nuclear missile submarines. And to a certain extent, at least in the West, that seems to be where, at least in terms of naming conventions, the navies have gone. Because if you look at the US battleships, they're all carrying state names. And what ships carry the state names these days? Well, it's the Ohio class and soon to be the Columbia class nuclear missile subs. Likewise in the UK, albeit that they have appropriated one or two old carrier names, but generally the V class, the Vanguard class, unsurprising with a name like Vanguard, and if you look at the previous ones, Resolution, Renown, etc., battleship names have all gone to the nuclear missile subs, and again we'll have Dreadnought, Warspite, King George VI, etc. in with the Dreadnought class. So yeah, I think capital ships you probably make a three-way argument, but in terms of absolute brutal levels of firepower, you can't really beat something that's going to lob a couple of hundred nukes at someone. So yeah, there's kind of a split version of your answer, both for flagship and capital ship. Bredley asks, if Japan enters World War I on the side of the Central Powers, what would Britain have done? Well, it's just too late for Admiral Fisher to go, ooh, free battle cruiser, as Congo has already been commissioned. But with regards to the Fusos and the Iseis being built and the other three Congos being built, well, maybe not all of the other three Congos, but certainly one or two at least, the British probably have gone, you declare for our enemies, do you? It's a real pity you're using those Vickers 14-inch guns, isn't it? Oh, well, I guess we have some spare 14-inch guns. Anyone buying? Yeah, that would be in the first action. Kind of cut the Japanese off at the knees with their heavy super dreadnought and battlecruiser armament programs, and obviously terminating, well, any and all support for the Japanese Navy, which at the time would have been a fairly nasty blow. The Japanese, I guess, could have gone after various colonies in the Pacific region, rather than go after the German ones as they did historically. There's not a tremendous amount the British can do about it initially, but given that the Japanese will basically be rocking up with, in terms of dreadnoughts at least, well, with the Kawachis and, yeah, maybe one or two Congos, they'd be putting themselves in rather dire straits because the Royal Navy will be forced to respond, and by the mid-war period, they almost certainly will be able to respond with at least a battle squadron or two, and that's not something that the Japanese Navy can stand up against. I mean, heck, the British had a few of the 13.5-inch battle cruisers, like Princess Royal, wandering around in the early part of the war, when their margin of superiority against the Germans was much less assured. Once the Queen Elizabeths and the Revenges start coming online in earnest, I mean, Dreadnought wasn't at Jutland because it was no longer really rated as a Grand Fleet battle unit, but Dreadnought is arguably quite superior to the Kawachis, so yeah, it would almost be like a miniature rerun of the Pacific War in World War II, in that basically through Britain not having much of anything in the area capable of standing up to the Japanese will start to make gains on various islands and such, but at some point British naval units will start showing up in worryingly large numbers, and the Japanese will really, really have a bad day because they will be committed to a decisive battle, and the British will be perfectly happy to give them a decisive battle. HMS New Zealand and Australia may well be around, which will, well, if you're putting New Zealand up against anyone, it's a little bit of an overkill, since you can't actually hit the blasted thing. So yeah, HMS New Zealand solos. But no, in all seriousness, if the Japanese don't see the writing on the wall and kind of quietly slink away halfway through the war, there will be a fairly substantial force sent over there at some point, at which time the Japanese Navy is going to end very badly, and they'll be forced to give everything back, because Japan is just as vulnerable to blockade in World War One as it is in World War Two, albeit that it's going to be the more traditional kind of blockade rather than the submarines everywhere and oh dear carrier aircraft as per World War Two. And now moving on to the Discord questions. The Judge 2107 asks, how come Bismarck was never fitted with torpedoes while her sister ship Tirpitz did? So the reason is that neither Bismarck nor Tirpitz were designed to carry torpedoes when they were built, but after the loss of Bismarck, Tirpitz was pulled back into Drydock for a rather hasty refit, which included, amongst other things, improved anti-aircraft firepower, somewhat understandably, but during this period they also took the chance to slap a couple of torpedo launchers onto the ship as well, basically because they were looking at it now being a fleet being in Norway with a particular aim towards convoy raiding, at which point, similar to most other merchant raiders and such, like, torpedoes were seen as an easy way to finish off crippled or damaged merchant ships. And I mean, it gave them a little bit of extra firepower in surface engagements as well, since, well, Rodney had just managed to torpedo Bismarck, so clearly they might have thought there might have been some merit in it. But yeah, it was basically as part of the refit and reconfiguration of Tirpitz for its role as a fleet in being in Norway. And since that took place after Bismarck was sunk, that's why Bismarck didn't get it. I mean, I suppose they could have sent a merchant ship or sea raider out into the Atlantic to drop a pair of quad torpedo launchers off into the depths over Bismarck's sinking site as some kind of weird semi-Celtic offering to its departed soul, but I think the Germans probably could have had better uses for a pair of quad torpedo launchers than that. Tyvaz asks, is there some physical limitation which prevents a naval shell with higher mass but smaller diameter from performing as well as a lower mass but higher diameter shell? The Washington Naval Treaty limitations only restricted guns by caliber. What prevented these restrictions from being circumvented with longer, heavier, smaller caliber shells? On land, in tank guns, penetrator rounds' effectiveness is generally proportional to the length of the penetrator and has far less to do with caliber. Why are ships so different? It's mostly a matter of physics, and it's mostly tied into scale. Bear in mind, with tank rounds, even modern-day tank rounds, they're fired from a gun that in naval terms wouldn't be considered fit for use on a battleship. Most guns being these days being 120mm weapons, considering that most battleships would have been carrying either 127 or 152mm guns. Especially when you go all the way back to World War II, when you're talking about 75mm guns and less, generally speaking, unless you're a Tiger, it's on a whole different scale. A Tiger's 88 gun is like a really fearsome anti-tank weapon in tank warfare in World War II. On a battleship, it would be considered a medium weight anti-aircraft weapon at best, and why the hell have you put this thing on our ship? Why can't we have something better? When you're talking up into the terms of hundreds of millimeters, like 200 plus or 300 plus, or in the case of some ships, even 400 plus millimeter guns, it's an entirely different ballgame in terms of physics. The kind of penetrators you're talking about are also solid, whereas armor-piercing shells for naval guns tend to carry explosive charges, which makes things different. But one of the major mistakes of the kind of armchair admiral, and to a certain extent even the armchair general, when looking at penetration, is to consider only kinetic energy, i.e. half mass times velocity squared. Yes, it gives you a certain indication of performance, but only amongst similar objects, and to rely purely on kinetic energy as some kind of metric is usually the mark of a rank amateur. Especially when you're talking about large projectiles, you also have to consider things like inertia and momentum, which are fairly related. In the mechanics of penetration, you also have to think about the fact that when you talk about penetration with high velocity shells, such as naval guns, especially battleship guns, it's no longer a case of considering things in terms of just tensile yield strengths and things like this. It's also the fact that you actually have to treat it more like a liquid collision, because the metal will deform and flow like a liquid under impact, unless you're talking up to like stupid velocities, which we don't have to generally in World War II guns. So what all of that is a very roundabout way of saying is that when you are using kind of like your high velocity, small caliber weapon, there are limits to what the shell can physically withstand, because it is volumetrically smaller, and therefore the overall stress that the shell can take is less because there's less material there. Whereas a larger shell, just by dint of being physically bigger and having therefore more metal in it, is going to be able to take more stress at the kind of impact energies that we're talking about. There's also the issue, as you're mentioning, about sort of a smaller, lighter shell, is that whole momentum and inertia factor of the fact that a very lightweight projectile, relatively speaking, I mean, a battleship shell is never going to be classified as lightweight by anybody sane. It's just a case of heavy or very, very heavy, or super heavy if you're American. Then a lighter weight shell has a far greater chance of ricochet, because the transference of energy and let's say the momentum of the shell, if it's heavier, it will want to keep going in that direction a heck of a lot more than a lighter weight thing. And this is the similar kind of thing you run into when you do comparisons of bullets versus arrows. It's the same kind of thing, especially when you're talking about penetration values. So to give you some example, I mean, a longbow arrow or crossbow bolt will carry nowhere near the same level of kinetic energy as, say, the round from a 2.2 handgun, a pistol. But if you're firing at a medieval breastplate, which is, I guess, could be our stand-in for battleship armor, the chances of you penetrating with a 2.2 pistol against a decent sort of 2-3 mil carbon steel breastplate is pretty minimal. Now, fair enough, against that kind of protection, even a crossbow bolt or a longbow arrow is going to struggle, except under ideal circumstances. But when you scale things down through the various grades of armor, you'll actually find that the arrow or the bolt, despite carrying much less kinetic energy, because it has so much more mass and therefore more momentum, will actually become superior at armor penetration a lot sooner than a very high velocity but low mass 2-2 bullet, which will just tend to skip off in random directions because it's much easier to redirect. So when we're talking about battleship grade stuff, and I mean you can actually see this even in the American Civil War when you're talking about things like the Dahlgren rifle, the Dahlgren guns, which are massive low velocity smashing weapons, because that's the kind of the effect that they have, and compared to something like a Parrott rifle, which is a much higher velocity, but not made in quite the same caliber sizes, but much better armor penetration. Assuming you can't just sort of blow your way through with sheer brute force and ignorance with a Dahlgren 15-inch gun or something like that. So yeah, it's unfortunately, I know the answer sounds a little bit waffly, but unfortunately, it's a very complex, possibly one of the most complex parts of naval warfare. And in fact, I guess what it comes down to ultimately is the fact that if you use a smaller, high velocity, low mass round, you're much more likely to either shatter it or skip it off the enemy protection. If you use a very high mass, low velocity round, your shell's much less likely to shatter. But if it's low velocity, then you may not break through at all in the first place. Which is why the kind of outside of the somewhat questionable decision to go with the Mark 8 super heavy shell on the later US 16-inch armed battleships, generally you see most naval shells are this kind of balance between velocity and mass, and that's basically the sweet spot. Almost every experiment in trying to jig it one way or the other, whether that be extra mass or extra velocity at the expense of shell weight, generally goes wrong. I mean, at the scale of naval guns, it's still going to have a rather devastating effect at the end of the shell's flight, but the efficiencies are markedly less, which is why, for example, when they were considering the Lion class's armament, the Royal Navy decided they weren't going to go down the low mass, high velocity route that the Nelson's guns did, because although the Nelson's guns were still pretty powerful, they weren't anywhere near as powerful as the Royal Navy would have liked them to be, or as far as powerful as the Royal Navy knew they could have made them if they'd gone with a slightly different design decision. And finally, there is also the matter of bursting charge. A bigger shell can carry a bigger bursting charge, which will do more damage, because when you're talking about something the scale of a battleship, yeah, you could in theory make like a railgun level velocity solid shot round, and then, as I mentioned, some other questions related to this, you poke a small hole in the ship, which doesn't do you a tremendous amount of good because you're not really likely to hit anything vital, statistically speaking, and a tiny hole is easily patched. You need, when you're shooting at something like a 30,000 ton plus battleship, you need to be able to deliver a considerable quantity of explosive to the interior of the ship to do any kind of meaningful damage. And simply put, yeah, you could have like an 8-inch saber round firing out of a battleship gun, and yes, that might well penetrate because it'll be going at insane velocity, assuming the shell doesn't shatter on impact. But when it explodes, a few kilos of explosive inside a battleship, yeah, it'll do some damage, but it's not going to do anything like the damage of multiple tens of kilos of explosive on a much heavier, bigger shell. TJ Wine asks, which navy did better with submarine warfare against merchant fleets, America in the Pacific or Germany in the Atlantic? Unfortunately, it's not really one of those questions you can give a straight answer to, simply on the basis of the fact that the operating environments were entirely different. And that's not just the oceans themselves, it's also the level and quality of opposition. If you just did a straight swap, the British would rip your hand off in their efforts to shake it and thank you from the highest of heavens for the absolute easy ride you've just given them. But that's not because US submarines are terrible or US submarine crews are awful. It's simply because they've got the Mark 14 torpedo, so you've basically handed the British a couple of years of free convoy runs because they can't actually hurt anything till they come to unless they want to surface, or they get the very, very occasional functioning torpedo. So, I mean, that's one factor. If you want to talk about historical stuff, yeah, historically speaking, the American submarine arm was terrible in the first few years of its engagement, but that was because it was handed a weapon that was probably better for beating the enemy over the head with physically in a boarding action than actually firing at them. Um, but outside of that, I mean, the Germans did have some issues with defective torpedoes early on, but that was more to do with magnetic detonators and something that they recognised a little bit faster than Bureau of Ordnance, although the phrase a little bit faster than Bureau of Ordnance can be applied to many things, including competitive snail racing. Anyway, getting back on topic. It's also, as I said, the level of opposition. Japanese anti-submarine warfare, obviously it did score successes. There are a fair number of wrecked US submarines at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean that are testimony to that, but Japanese anti-submarine warfare was nowhere near as advanced, well organised, or as lethal as the Royal Navy, and with great help from the Canadians and others, let's call it the Royal Navy's anti-submarine warfare efforts were a considerable step above the Japanese. So again, transplant them in a straight swap. The Germans are like, oh, what? No one's shooting at us? Or maybe one person shooting at us. Never mind. The German U-boat arm, assuming it had the range to actually reach the Japanese shipping, which is a whole other factor. But assuming you somehow magically transplanted them there, they'd go hog wild on the Japanese in 1941 and 1942, thanks to, well, functioning torpedoes and the fact that they're used to fighting the Royal Navy, and Japanese anti-submarine warfare is not even a scratch on that. They would have decimated the Japanese really fast, again, assuming that they could actually get there. Whereas, yeah, back in the Atlantic, actually having to deal with organised convoy escorts with sonar and various things like Hedgehog and such probably wouldn't do many favours for the American submarine fleet. That said, on the other hand, ultimately, the Germans failed to eradicate British Imperial and Allied shipping from the Atlantic. The Americans had considerably more success in wiping out practically anything afloat and moving in the Western Pacific. So, if you want to judge them on pure results, in terms of did they achieve their mission objectives, the American submarine fleet is way ahead of the Germans in the fact they actually won, which kind of helps. But as I say, it's not something that I could comfortably say one side did better than the other because, yeah, as I say, the Americans actually won their campaign, the Germans didn't. On the other hand, the Germans faced a lot more opposition, a lot more organised opposition. So, transplant the two, you can make snide comments about who would, one side reaping the other or whatever, but ultimately, if you put a professional submarine corps in a completely different operational environment, once they've taken their initial losses, they are going to learn and adapt. And for obvious reasons, unless anyone's developed an alternate history dimension hopping machine, we don't know how an American submarine force would have adapted to something like the mass convoys and sonar and forward-throwing depth-charge launchers of the Royal Navy. So, yeah, there you go. Can't answer it, but there are factors to consider that might help you come up with your own conclusion. And finally, for today, Revan UTC-8 asks, if part of the French fleet had been deployed in the north of France during World War II, how well do you think French battleships like Richelieu would have fared against the likes of Gneisenau and Bismarck? So I guess we're looking at a hypothetical scenario where, being based in northern France, they kind of skedaddle across the Channel as per some historical French ships and end up fighting for the Free French. Well, Dunkirk and Strasbourg would be very useful hunting German Deutschland-class ships. Would necessarily want to send them against the Scharnhorst or Gneisenau. I mean, yes, they theoretically have slightly heavier firepower, but they really do not have the armor protection to fight a Scharnhorst class. Maybe if they're operating in concert with another ship, so if we're talking about, say, like Renown or Repulse accompanied by Dunkirk or Strasbourg in a pair versus Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, then yeah, that could be a perfectly legitimate argument to have. And of course, the fact there are effectively two more battle cruisers means that the Royal Navy's in a much better place to hunt down German raiders. So you might have might have, say, a 3 battle cruiser force of either Renown or Repulse, along with Dunkirk and Strasbourg, going out trying to hunt down Scharnhorst and Gneisenau when they break out into the Atlantic. So that'd be a possibility. But Dunkirk and Strasbourg would be at a disadvantage in a capital ship fight thanks to their lack of armour and the fact that their guns are not dramatically more powerful as compared to something like Renown's 15-inch guns. On the other hand, Richelieu, assuming it could overcome its issues with exploding guns, assuming Richelieu is fitted and, as I say, fixes its issues, that is a very good matchup for Bismarck. I mean, it's actually faster than Bismarck, so Bismarck can run away. It can hold a bearing. It's the entire firepower is forward, so it can hold a bearing that's very not quite nose in, because this isn't World of Warships. You do not bow tank, but it can reduce the range very quickly. It can angle its belt armor fairly well, and assuming it's been refitted with sort of Allied radar and fire control systems, it's quite happily a match for Bismarck. So yeah, if Bismarck had sailed and Richelieu had gone out with Prince of Wales instead of Hood, because having Richelieu available, to be honest, would allow Hood to go straight into refit. That would have been a very different battle. I think I've covered in some other questions. Richelieu has a very good chance of putting Bismarck down on its own, and if it's Richelieu and Prince of Wales versus Bismarck and Prince Eugen, I can't really see that ending well for the Germans. I mean, Bismarck obviously still has a reasonable chance of putting Richelieu down, don't get me wrong, but Richelieu is a much, much tougher customer for Bismarck compared to Hood for various reasons. So yes, it could have been quite interesting. The Richelieu, and I mean, I suppose they could have maybe gotten away with Jean Bart as well, but the Richelieu class would have made very useful additions to the Allied forces against German warships. Dunkirk and Strasbourg, maybe not so much, but still useful. And that brings us to the end of Drydock episode 53. Quick reminder, if you are planning to enter the Battlecruiser design competition, you have exactly 1 week left for your entries. I have quite a few entries already, and I'm beginning to sort through them as we speak. For those of you who chose non-physical prizes, i.e. reviews, questions answered, etc. in the last competition, do not worry. I am putting together a video for that, and it will be done before the next competition closes. It's just I had quite a few videos that I had research scripted, etc. that were ready to go, or near enough ready to go in the past month. So I kind of had to prioritise those. But yes, so August shall see your rewards come through. Other than that, thank you very much for listening. Hope you're still enjoying the Drydocks, and see you for Drydock episode 54 or whatever other video might be coming up on Wednesday. Cheers, bye.